Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brendan Mirka, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Lessard Research Group at the University of Ottawa. Today I'll be speaking about a recent study we have completed concerning the influence of polymer in single-walled carbon nanotube dispersions and how it affects the performance of field effect transistors. Additionally, the presence of polymer in carbon nanotube dispersions relates to the efficiency of preparing nanotube dispersions. Electronic applications of carbon nanotubes are a subset of the field of flexible and organic electronics. Flexible electronics deals with carbon-based semiconductors incorporated into electronic devices that had previously been built on inorganic semiconductors. Carbon-based semiconductors can be incorporated into electronics using solution processing means, such as printing technologies, which can facilitate inexpensive and large-scale fabrication. However, the performance of carbon-based electronics is still significantly lower than that of inorganic electronics. Single-walled carbon nanotubes are an allotropic form of carbon, analogous to a sheet of graphene rolled into a tube 1 to 2 nanometers in diameter. The high degree of conjugation and the one-dimensional density of states gives carbon nanotubes an exceptionally high electrical conductivity, alongside mechanical flexibility and thermal stability, making them ideal candidates for incorporation into flexible electronics to help improve device performance. Unfortunately, though, all synthetic pathways result in carbon nanotubes with different diameters and different chiralities, resulting in carbon nanotubes being either semiconducting or metallic in nature. This is problematic for certain device applications. Metallic nanotubes are detrimental to semiconducting applications and will short-circuit devices. Furthermore, carbon nanotubes are highly insoluble. Fortunately, we can extract semiconducting carbon nanotubes in high purities using conjugated polymers. Conjugated polymers can selectively wrap around semiconducting nanotubes, forming a non-covalent supramolecular complex. The formation of a non-covalent complex with the polymer allows dispersion of individual nanotubes in solvent, thereby facilitating solution processing of carbon nanotubes. Additionally, the formation of a non-covalent complex with the polymer also leaves the electrical properties intact. Conjugated polymer extraction is a simple and effective means of preparing high-purity dispersions of semiconducting nanotubes. One begins by mixing raw nanotubes and polymer into solvent. Next, the dispersion is sonicated, which causes the polymer to exfoliate and disperse semiconducting carbon nanotubes. Then the dispersion is centrifuged to remove the non-dispersed metallic nanotubes along with other impurities, which remain in large bundles. The last step is filtration, which will be the central theme of my presentation. It has been the convention to remove excess polymer from the dispersion, meaning the polymer that is dissolved in solution and not bound to any nanotubes. Of the entire procedure, filtration is the most time-consuming and resource-intensive. Filtering out excess polymer can take 1 to 3 weeks, depending on the polymer, and consume solvent on the scale of 5 to 10 liters per gram of carbon nanotube. One cannot help but see this step as a bottleneck in an attempt to increase the scale of conjugated polymer extraction. Is there a justifiable reason to remove the excess polymer from the dispersion before fabricating devices? How would this affect FET performance? How would this affect film morphology, which is, of course, related to FET performance? For this study, we prepared carbon nanotube dispersions using 2 conjugated polymers: a polycarbazole copolymerized with a fluorine, or PCF for short, and a polyfluorine copolymerized with a methoxybenzene, or PFMB for short. First, we prepared our excess polymer dispersion, or EP for short, by carrying out the procedure without the filtration. And then we prepared our no excess polymer dispersion by taking a portion and filtering it to remove the excess polymer. Next, we took some of the no excess polymer dispersion and added controlled amounts of polymer in order to compare the performance to excess polymer dispersions. Lastly, we divided all of the dispersions into 3 nanotube concentrations using the carbon nanotube S22 peak height for reference, which can be seen in the absorption spectra. We'll go over the procedure we use to fabricate field effect transistors. We begin with a cleaned and surface-treated wafer with a doped silicon gate and a 300 nanometer SiO2 dielectric. And then we drop cast our carbon nanotube dispersion onto the surface and allow the film to dry. Next, we rinse the wafer with solvent to remove any excess polymer and debris from the film. We argue that a simple solvent rinse is sufficient to remove the excess polymer after the film has formed, and that filtering out the excess polymer is superfluous. Lastly, we deposit our gold source drain electrodes on top of the carbon nanotube film in order to complete the fabrication of our FET. So what we wanted to determine first is whether or not a solvent rinse can sufficiently remove excess polymer from carbon nanotube films. To demonstrate that rinsing is effective, we utilized Raman spectroscopy with an excitation wavelength of 514 nanometers. 514 nanometers is in resonance with our carbon nanotube, and it also overlaps with the polymer absorbance. Therefore, the nanotubes and the polymer signals will be visible in the spectra. The black spectra here are from films of pristine polymer without any carbon nanotubes present and without any rinsing. So 2 peaks for PCF are visible at 1607 and 1627 wave numbers, and 1 peak for PFMB is visible. Immediately after rinsing 4 times with 1 milliliter of toluene, we see a significant reduction in fluorescence and peak intensity. When we look at the spectra of polymer carbon nanotube, we can see the polymer peaks distinctly from the carbon nanotube G band, which is around 1590 wave numbers. As we continue to rinse in 1 milliliter increments, the fluorescence drops significantly and the peaks are barely present, especially after 4 rinses. Note that the spectra are normalized to the semiconducting G band. So the Raman spectra suggest that simply rinsing the substrate with a few milliliters of solvent removes nearly all of the excess polymer from the carbon nanotube film. After Raman spectroscopy experiments, we began fabricating field effect transistors, or FETs for short. For each FET, we generated an output curve and a transfer curve. So the output curves on the left are representative curves for no excess polymer and excess polymer. These curves are indistinguishable from one another. Most importantly, they both demonstrate field effect behavior, and the origins of each curve are linear. The rationale for filtering out excess polymer is that the excess polymer will increase contact resistance in FETs. Increased contact resistance, however, does not appear in our output curves, and this corroborates the Raman spectroscopy study we did in the previous slide, showing that simply rinsing removes most of the excess polymer. For the transfer curves, we plotted the data for all of the FETs fabricated under a single condition, and each figure represents data from 27 FETs, and each FET was scanned 4 times. From the transfer curves, it is apparent that the excess polymer FETs are less variable to the no excess polymer FETs. The off currents are lower, and the variance in threshold voltage also appears to be lower for the excess polymer FETs. A reduction in variance would be consistent with film morphology that is more homogeneous and contains less carbon nanotube bundles. When comparing the field effect mobility, there does not appear to be a statistically significant difference between FETs with no excess polymer and FETs with excess polymer. Therefore, the FET data does not justify spending excess time and resources on removing excess polymer from the nanotube dispersion before FET fabrication. The study on thin film morphology was the final aspect of our study and gave us an insight into the FET data. The film formation on polymer carbon nanotube films is crucial for understanding device performance. A comprehensive study of film morphology requires both nanoscale and micron scale measurements to probe individual carbon nanotubes and the entire FET channel. We utilize Raman mapping for micron scale measurements and atomic force microscopy for nanoscale measurements. Using an excitation wavelength of 785 nanometers, we mapped the carbon nanotube G-band intensity throughout the FET channel. The figure on the left here shows the Raman maps overlaid onto FET channels for no excess polymer, and polymer added. When looking at the data, it is immediately apparent that the variance in intensity for excess polymer is much lower than that of no excess polymer. This suggests that the film formation of excess polymer dispersions is more homogeneous and corroborates our FET data. The differences in G-band intensity also corroborate the higher off-currents observed from no excess polymer dispersions. We attribute this to an increased carbon nanotube bundling in no excess polymer films. To probe the nanoscale morphology, we used atomic force microscopy, or AFM. Each image is a representative image of the respective polymer concentration and the carbon nanotube concentration. Each image was 5 by 5 microns and is on a height scale of 13 nanometers. Upon visual inspection, the excess polymer films do appear to be more homogeneous compared to the no excess polymer films. Also, for the films with 4 megs per mil of polymer added, there does appear to be some polymer residue left over on the film. Unfortunately, it indicates that in this case, the solvent rinse, or the number of rinses, was insufficient. Unfortunately, though, interpreting AFM images can be subjective and is prone to human error. Important parameters to consider when analyzing AFM images are the carbon nanotube density and the surface coverage. The nanotube density can be determined from AFM images by manually counting the number of nanotubes. This is incredibly time-consuming, tedious, and is prone to human error, and therefore limited to only a few images. Using artificial intelligence, the carbon nanotube density can be determined reproducibly for large sets of images. One of the authors of the study developed an AFM software for use in our lab. The software can determine the number of carbon nanotubes in an image, the fraction of surface coverage, the nanotube length and orientation, and the number of intersections. The program works by first segmenting pixels into carbon nanotube and non-carbon nanotube, thus eliminating non-nanotube artifacts. The image is then processed using a genetic algorithm to extract the carbon nanotube parameters, such as the number of nanotubes or the orientation. The development of this software was a significant advancement for our study, as what would previously have been unfeasible could be done in a short amount of time. The software was able to determine that the surface coverage of no excess polymer and excess polymer films were equivalent within error. I should mention, though, that the software is only capable of a two-dimensional analysis, and it cannot distinguish between film thicknesses. So when we combine the results of the surface coverage to that of the Raman mapping, we can see that notwithstanding equivalent surface coverages, the films with no excess polymer possess more carbon nanotube bundling, which is evidenced by the higher variance in G-band intensity from the Raman mapping. In conclusion, we have studied the influence of excess polymer and carbon nanotube dispersions. Our findings do not support the belief that the removal of excess polymer before FET fabrication is a necessary step. FETs fabricated with excess polymer dispersions performed no worse, and in some cases better, than FETs fabricated with filtered dispersions. Film morphological studies show that films made with excess polymer dispersions are more homogeneous, which is also corroborated with FET data. Thus, the presence of excess polymer in a nanotube dispersion is crucial for film formation. Additionally, we've developed an AFM software that will be useful for future thin film morphology studies. I would like to thank my research group, and I will happily take any questions now. Thank you.